Hi everyone, welcome to Cooking with Artists. My name is Mina Stone. I'm the chef and owner of Mina's Restaurant at MoMA PS1. I wanted to interview different artists and have them share something personal about cooking and food from their world. My hope is that it shines a light on the essence of who they are, their work, and hopefully who we are as a society.
Well, let's see. I'm an artist who's lived in New York City for the last 20 some odd years. And the core of my practice is portraiture. But I now consider portraiture is kind of like this seed in the middle of everything. And I think that that's true in the way that it's like about looking at people and who we are and what do we do and how do we live and what do we make and what kind of stories do we tell. The first major project that I ever did as an artist was this like almost 20-year long series of street portraits that I would paste out onto the walls of the city. And then I started building out installations. I spent a few years doing a series of rafts that like 30 plus people lived on. I then went on to do a sort of about 10 years of working with sustainable architecture and rebuilding in kind of post disaster situations. But all of these in the mind of, who are we as people and what do we need and how does beauty and play and communal work like affect our quality of life and build our lives. Yes, I have this powerful experience that happened a few years ago with cornbread. And so um how what happened is, like I said, I had a difficult couple of years, and it started with my mom passed away from lung cancer, and then about a year and a half later my dad committed suicide. And that was, I think, the part where I was like, oh my god, I'm sort of barely hanging in here at this moment. The compounding of that death and the way that that happened and the way that um the I think, we all lose our parents, and I think what we find is that anything that's unresolved from childhood is going to come up when you have that loss. And there was quite a lot for me. And but in the months after my dad passed away, I my chest was really tight and I had this like pain, and I to the point where I was like, should I get this looked at? And I was like, no, I think it's just pain. I think I'm just hurting. I think I'm just this is grief. But it just kept being there and it kept being there. So I took one bite of this cornbread, and all of a sudden I was back in like our kitchen when I was 5. And the thing about that period of my life is that, so my parents had been major addicts up until that point. They'd been addicted to heroin. Our life had been super chaotic. And then my dad had a suicide attempt. He went into rehab. He came out, and he was like super dad. He was like, I'm taking care of my kids. He was a single dad. He was going to school. He was like, we had this beautiful little like subsidized housing over by the beach in Florida. It was like amazing. And we had this beautiful white tiny little table, and I realized what that table meant to me is we kept it so clean, and it was like this, everything is safe here, everything is okay here, what's going to happen at this table. And he would make this cornbread, and I think it must have just been this box mix. I just went back in my bed and I laid down and I pulled this cornbread out of my pocket and I just ate it and wept. I just wept for like an hour, just like slowly, like just like letting this taste like spark this memory, and just crying and crying and crying in a way of like, I had been so angry at my dad because, he left, he committed suicide, he abandoned me, I was furious. And this little piece of cornbread was like, hey, don't forget like the home that you made. And the amazing thing was this, so I cried and cried and cried, and then the chest pain went away and it never came back. It was like it moved this thing that had been sitting on my chest, because I could weep, and because I could appreciate him. Well, I just had it for breakfast actually. And the reason that I had it for breakfast is because in advance of this interview, I decided to resurrect my mom's cornbread. So yeah, this is very cornbread related. Yeah. So she used to make this beautiful cornbread, and it was like she it would cook it in a cast iron skillet, and she'd put in like tons of corn and cheese, like tons of cheese, tons of eggs, like jalapeno. She used to say that it was almost like a cross between a quiche and a cornbread, and you could kind of just eat it as a meal. You could just like take a big ass chunk of that thing, and like that could be your lunch. Because it had like all this kind of like, and sometimes she'd put zucchini or mushrooms or whatever, just like throw stuff in there. And when I made it, it was like another one of those experiences where I was like, oh my God, like all of these last few years, because of the work that I've been doing to heal the traumatic upbringing of growing up around addiction. And because when you have to heal, and you're focusing on the pain, you're focusing on the suffering because you got to feel it to heal it, right? So you're really like, I've been doing all this writing and all this talking about um moments where my mom was deeply unstable. Um, but the truth that I always try to keep in mind is that that was only part of her, and that wasn't even the most important part of her. And when I made this cornbread, and it was so fucking delicious, and I hadn't used my stove or my oven in like God knows when, and I made it, and it was so profound. This sense of that it was like you brought something forward in time. It was like it was like I kept your tradition alive. Your tradition is here. Like it's a physical thing. Like the bread still rises, the cheese is still warm, like it's still here. And so yeah, being able to make that cornbread was just like resurrecting love. It really was. One of my dearest collaborators, Jeff Stark, he got really inspired by, in Europe, there's a lot of big squats, and a lot of the big squats have these big dinners together. Um, and he was like, the importance of these dinners is that we're not getting together and watching a movie, we're not watching a play, we're just eating. And so he was like, let's start a dinner at this like kind of party space on its like day off in New York. And so we started this like dumpstered meal, and we would go to all the different like grocery stores. I don't even really know. I think that a lot of times the garbage is like locked up these days, but back then you could just go to all the health food stores, go in the dumpsters, even just on the sidewalk. People would just throw out like crazy amounts of food. And so we would just go collect all that food, just on bikes. People would have little baskets on the back of their bikes, go to all the different places. Okay, meet you on Sunday. We'd all meet up, and we would just have this table full of food. That was so fun too, was just watching people kind of like get visionary. Somebody would be like, oh my God, what do you have? Like, why do we have, 15 pounds of celery? Like, what are we going to do with this? And then somebody would be like, I got it. Um, and then like we would serve like 50 people. And actually that reminds me of another just like funny thing that happened with food on the rafts. So one time it was like early morning, and we would make coffee in this like huge pot, and it was like cowboy coffee. We'd like stir in this huge pot because we had 30 of us. So somebody's making the coffee, and they like walk away, do something, and then somebody else comes over, and they're gonna do, I don't know, something else, make something. So they're like not paying attention, and they just pour like a shit ton of vegetable oil into the coffee. And they're like, oh fuck. Like, yeah, they're like, that's not where I thought this was, and then everyone's like, oh fuck, the coffee, like we need to wake up. And you don't want to waste stuff, especially you're living like 30 people on a raft. So we're like, what are we gonna do with this? And then one of our friends, who's just like this brilliant human, he's like, stop. He's like, don't throw that away. I know that this is possibility. I know I can make something from this. And he just like thinks for a second, and he's like, frosting. And he just proceeds to take this coffee full of vegetable oil, and he just makes this like gorgeous frosting out of it. And we whip out bread, or where somebody like makes like pancakes or something, and we're just like slathering it with coffee frosting. It was brilliant. cooking is such a creative act. And it is this way that you're making something from, you're really transforming things. And I always think of art as an act of transformation, that you take these things and then you tell a story, you apply forces, and you transform it into something which is like, if I started with a scallion and I bit into a scallion, I'd be like, eh. But like after I transformed the cornbread, all of a sudden I had this whole entire experience and history of family.